doing a little bit of zigzagging. David Birkin is an artist based in New York. He studied anthropology at Oxford University, fine art at the Slade in London, and was a studio fellow of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. Much of Birkin's work reflects on the way war is depicted and the language and legal frameworks that underpin it. Past projects have included a collaboration with the courtroom sketch artist at the Guantanamo military tribunals, a photographic transcription of identification numbers from the Iraqi civilian casualty database, an extract of CIA legalese in skywriting above Manhattan, and a plane circling the Statue of Liberty's torch. Earlier this year, he unfurled a banner from the Queensboro Bridge as a part of the Bridges, Not Walls Day of Action to coincide with Trump's inauguration. Birkin has written for Freeze, Cabinet Magazine, Creative Time Reports, Ibraz, The Harvard Advocate, and the American Civil Liberties Union blog. He also manages a studio of artist Martha Rosler. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that Noah brought up this question of responsibility, because when I was thinking about this set of questions that were posed, the first thing that it made me think about was something that Teju Cole, the photography critic and writer, wrote about the need to think constellationally. By connecting the dots in a society that supports brutal policies in the morning, founds charities in the afternoon, and receives awards in the evening. And then he goes on basically to say that otherwise cultural production becomes readily recuperated by mainstream neoliberal ideology and ends up simply functioning as a release valve for what he calls the unbearable pressures that build in a system built on pillage. And I think that's a really, really accurate description. Having said that, I think there are other people who are better qualified to talk about institutional complicity and economic complicity, for example, like Noah. And what I was saying before was that my mind kind of tried to flip the question and think, well, what's the opposite of complicity? If complicity is by definition something that's that's tied to immorality and illegality, unlawfulness, what's a kind of positive manifestation of that? And I thought, really, it's responsibility, and this is something that that Noah was touching on, and it goes to the heart of, I think, what a lot of artists try to figure out, which is what does it mean to be an artist in ethical terms, this relationship between ethics and aesthetics, and what it means to have an ethical practice, not necessarily a kind of tick every box kind of worthier than thou practice, but something that actually means something in terms of integrity or your own personal relationship to truth. And I keep coming back to Judith Butler, who talks about, she's talking in the context of Emmanuel Levinas, but she's talking about the responsibility that we have to those faces that are obscured. A lot of the work that I do deals with, you mentioned that the civilian casualty database in Iraq. So a lot of it is either photographic or performative, but the photographic side of it deals primarily with those faces that are obscured, those people who are left out of the photographic record. And Butler says that the meaning of responsibility is bound up with an anxiety that remains open, that does not settle an ambivalence through disavowal, but rather gives rise to a certain ethical practice, one that is both experimental and fully fallible, but which tries to attend to the precariousness of life. And this idea of fallibility and a constant renegotiation, I think, is, for me, key, because as soon as you start trying to settle the ambivalence, as she says, and sort of make it cut and dried, I think you're lost. I think that relates a lot to what we as artists, or as visual artists, or as photographers, are trying to do in terms of the frame, and in terms of trying to adjust what's perceivable, that kind of thing. But then I started thinking about kind of more direct forms of responsibility, and what I think are the false distinctions that are often made between artist and activist. I mean, activist as a term is slightly problematic. It actually has, I found out recently that it goes back to to Sweden during the First World War. People were described as activists when they were trying to agitate for Sweden, for the Swedish king to come into the First World War on the side of the German Kaiser. So it's got this very odd kind of beginning. And like any ist, it can have a tendency to sort of flatten out or to kind of ghettoize the work of certain groups of people, when in fact what we need to be doing, as Noah was saying, is creating broad coalitions between people who already have been doing grassroots work, not trying to kind of create this new class of people who are just activists and that's their only thing. But at the same time, I was interested in why we come up against a lot of these distinctions, these attempts to define what an artist is and where the border, to draw a line, as you say, between what an artist is and what an activist is. And so I'm just going to read an extract from a thing that I wrote last year, kind of looking at that. Definitions are rarely neutral. Attempts to draw a hard line between art and activism often stem from a need to validate, regulate, or constrain people's voices. And they have the effect of flattening out the slippages and the contradictions where meaning is generated. What's more, this kind of pigeonholing ultimately serves to reinforce elitist and class-rooted conceptions of what qualifies as high culture, bolstering a commercially and ideologically driven desire to determine what art should or shouldn't be, or who can or cannot speak as an artist, while at the same time devaluing many artists' attempts to contribute to a broader political dialogue. Nevertheless, it can be instructive to question why such tired distinctions persist and the motivating forces behind them. There's nothing mutually exclusive about art and activism, except insofar as this dialectic plays out into some well-worn tropes stemming from the 19th century notion of art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art. Walter Benjamin observed how art, which began to lose its ritual function during the Renaissance as it developed into a secular cult of beauty, reacted to both the advent of photography and to the rise of socialism with this doctrine of art for art's sake, a theology of art, as he described it, that in turn brought about a negative theology in the form of the idea of pure art that was denied any social function. George Orwell echoed this view in his essay, Why I Write, when he stated, the opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is in itself a political attitude. Looking beyond these European perspectives, the poet, cultural theorist, and former Senegalese president Léopold Senghor emphasized art's functional, collective, and committed nature, describing an interpretation of art and literature that, quote, assimilates beauty with goodness, and especially with efficacy. And that's where I want to leave it. I think that we need a renewed conception of what constitutes art, and the idea of beauty being bound up with efficacy and with goodness is not a bad place to start.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Your references were really good. I want you to remember them for our discussion. I think about Alfred Jarret, who wrote Ubu-Ra, amongst other things, who said, he said, to be an artist, he said, I don't make political art because to be an artist in a capitalist world is already a political act, which is such a simple, sort of silly, flattening thing to say, but rings 100% true. But I think there's a lot more there, and yeah, we're going to come back to your quotes.